Hello, fellow Illumineers, and welcome to our very first deck tech. Today we're going to be talking about a deck list that I've been working on for a little while. I call this deck list a Noi-ing combo. It's actually more of an Ariel combo deck, but I'll go into that in a little bit. Let's talk about the combo first. This is a Sapphire Steel list, and it features Ariel Whoseit Collector. This is a 4-ink uninkable 3/3. This is actually from Chapter 1, and that quests for 1 lore, but has the ability called Look at This Stuff. Whenever you play an item, you may ready this character. You may notice that this lacks that clause that's so common throughout all other characters that says, this character can't quest for the remainder of this turn. This is the only character in Chapter 1 that was missing that clause, meaning that this character could quest over and over and over and over again. Whereas all those other ones, they could maybe challenge or sing, but they couldn't quest once they got readied up a second time. The combo is basically just Ariel plus tons of items. The most notable item to play alongside her is Eye of the Fates. This is a 4-ink item with the ability that says See the Future. Exert this item, chosen character gets +1 lore pip this turn. That means if you use Eye of Fates and you choose Ariel, Ariel now quests for 2 lore instead of 1. And these Eye of Fates do stack, so if you have 3 Eye of Fates out and all of them give their sight to Ariel, she then quests for 4 instead of 1. And because of this, you can get a lot of lore out of Ariel in a single turn. A surprising amount. I would say on average it's between somewhere 4 and 8, so I'd say average is about 6 on a good turn. That's kind of the crux of the deck. So once you get Eye of the Fates out, you put it on Ariel, so Ariel's now questing for 2 or even 3 if you have another Eye of Fates. Then you try and play as many items as you can in a single turn, and then quest, and win the game. There's some other things you can do with Ariel, though. Questing is the obvious one because it wins the game, but you may be in such a poor position, as sometimes is the case with combo decks. They basically do nothing for 4 turns, and they try and win on that 5th or 6th or 7th turn. So, they're almost always fighting from very, very far behind board state. Some of the other things you can do with Ariel include multiple challenges in a turn. She's a 3/3, which isn't like incredible, but she can basically wipe out a bunch of smaller characters. Like she can take out a bunch of those Cinderella Ballroom Sensations, Stitches, and all those things in a single turn. She may end up getting knocked out and banished doing it, but there's a lot of cards in this deck that can help extend her reach, her ability to challenge multiple times. Things like Popsicle, a very famous new item from the second set that made this deck possible. You can banish a Popsicle to take damage off of Ariel. Sometimes you're going to need to pivot into a more offensive role in order to stall the game out a little longer so you can set up a winning board state. So more often what you're going to do is you're going to quest with Ariel or do something with her, then play an item to ready her, and then just pass the turn. That way she can't be challenged. Because as a 3/3, she's a little squishy as a 4-drop. She can get banished fairly easily, so you really don't want to leave her in an exerted state where she can be challenged unless, you have bodyguards or the opponent's board is pretty bad. You've banged it up a lot so they can't take down Ariel. Or you're just willing to risk it because you have the game win in another way. Very often items can just ready Ariel so she can't be challenged. And the last clever way you can use Ariel as a support engine, and by that I mean the actual ability support, which says whenever you quest with a character, that character then grants its strength to another character of your choice. So you can imagine if Ariel can quest 3 times in one turn, she can give out a total of 9 strength in chunks of 3 to multiple chosen characters. So you can give some of your smaller characters a huge buff and they can send them out to take down things like giant Tinkerbells. So let's talk about some of the items. So you want thingamabobs? I've got 20. Precisely 20. I think it was originally 21 or 22, but for the meme, I had to cut it down to 20 because if you're going to run a deck with Ariel, you're going to have exactly 20 thingamabobs. The first 4 I want to talk about are kind of the 1-drops. It's very important that your items are 1 ink because you want to be able to play as many of them as you can in a turn. The cheaper they are, the better. And in fact, it almost doesn't even matter what it is they do, so long as they cost as little as possible. And that was the case, with Chapter 1. But with the introduction of Rise of the Floodborn and Popsicle, we got a few items that are actually fairly good for this deck, which surprised me that Popsicle came out this early in this game's existence. That feels very much like a Magic the Gathering card. And Popsicle definitely shows it off. I think it's made waves in the competitive scene. Those waves I think have since kind of subsided a little bit, but for quite a while everyone was just saying Popsicle is the greatest thing since frozen sugar. But we have some other good ones that came out of this set, including Last Cannon. We're also going to be talking about Scepter of Arendelle and Magic Golden Flower from the first set. So these are all of our 1-drop items. We're going to run as many of them as we can. I think I've tweaked these numbers a little bit. For the most part, we're running 4 of each of these. But let's talk about Last Cannon real quick. This is a new one from Rise of the Floodborn. It has the ability, it costs 1 ink, obviously, and is inkable. And it has the ability called Arm Yourself. You may pay an ink and banish this item, and then chosen character gains challenger +3 this turn. So for a while, I thought this was probably the worst item in this deck. I was just filler. Cheaper than a gumbo pot. I just needed any item that cost 1 ink, and this filled a slot. But it actually turns out that this item is useful. We run a lot of disposable characters in this list, characters that are kind of one and done. They do their thing, they contribute to the cause, and then they just kind of hang out and watch the rest of the game. Well, Last Cannon can suit up these 1/2 Simba future kings and send it off to take down a Kuzco. Or Cinderella Knight in Training can take down a giant Tinkerbell. A sudden +3 rush of strength does make a lot of these disposable characters suddenly relevant in the later game. So I actually found out Last Cannon is a lot better than I thought. So this thing is a little bit more than just Flaversham food. And we can talk about Popsicle next. So this is kind of like the most infamous item. I had mentioned, it's a 1-drop item that draws a card. It replaces itself by drawing a card. We call that a cantrip in Magic the Gathering. If you play Dungeons and Dragons, you know that cantrips are like these spells that don't cost spell slots. They don't use your resources. They're kind of like free spells. Popsicle is a 1 ink item that has 2 abilities. Jumbo Pop. When you play this item, you may draw a card, and that's Redwood. Banish this item to remove 2 damage from chosen character. So compared to Magic Golden Flower, Popsicle is a pushed card, but it's the kind of power level that you expect in the Magic, so hopefully we can see more of this stuff coming out in the near future. The other 2 that I wanted to talk about that are 1 ink are Scepter of Arendelle and Magic Golden Flower. I don't really need to talk about Magic Golden Flower. I've already talked about it. It's a 1 ink inkable item that has an ability called Healing Pollen. Banish me to heal 3 damage or remove 3 damage from chosen character. Old card from set 1. It's now the weakest card in this list. I thought it might have been the Last Cannon, but Last Cannon has legs. It's very useful in the late game. Magic Golden Flower is very rarely satisfactory to use. Only when Ariel is having to get down and dirty and start challenging and knocking out characters are you happy to have a Magic Golden Flower sitting in the corner. The Scepter of Arendelle was when I was talking about earlier, when we talked about Ariel in the support role. This gives any character support. You can choose any character, and that character then gains support. Support means whenever they quest, you may add their strength to another chosen character's strength this turn. I think it's actually a pretty good card. I really enjoy playing around with it. It's very affordable in that it's 1 ink. Something that you can use your first turn on, assuming you're not playing like a hyper aggro meta where people are playing Layla Making a Wish or Maleficent on turn 1. You can afford to take turn 1 off. Most turn 1 characters are not super relevant to the matchup. Some other items I want to talk about in our thingamabobs. I've only talked about 4, but I've actually talked about probably 15 of the 20. We have Eye of the Fates, Mouse Armor, and then I have an honorable mention here for Frying Pan. So Eye of Fates, of course, I don't need to talk a whole lot more about this card. It is the kind of, I mentioned it in the combo, 4 ink. We want to run as many of these because smarter, savvier players or playing this deck over and over again, people are going to know to banish Ariel the moment she pops up. And because of that, you kind of have to pivot away from Ariel. She ends up being bait. And then you want to use Eye of Fates basically on anyone else. That's kind of your win con. It's kind of the flute, Sleepy's flute of this list. It's Sorcerer's Spellbook, which both of those cards have become popular in the newer set. Eye of Fates is the card out of the first set, and it still continues to fill that role very nicely of a card that will get you an incidental 3, 4, 5 lore per game under your opponent's radar. The other 2 that I talked about, Mouse Armor and Frying Pan. The reason I honorable mention Frying Pan is I actually removed it from the list just recently based on some of the feedback I had, some of the games I've played with this list and the kind of the meta that I'm facing here within my group, which is very steel heavy. Having a resist +1 that persists through our opponent's turn is significantly more important than Frying Pan. But let's talk about Frying Pan real quick. I want to, because this card is not awful. I actually did not run it for a long time, and then we were working on the item count, trying to make this deck as consistent as possible, and we needed more items. Brought in Frying Pans, and then I realized, hey, this is better than I thought. So Frying Pan is a 2 ink steel item that has the ability Clang. Banish this item. Chosen character can't challenge during their next turn. It should have been, who knew? It's a fine piece of cookware, but as a weapon, it's truly stunning. That's good favorite text. So the Frying Pan is basically just a 2 ink item, which makes it significantly worse than all the other items in that if you have 5 ink when Ariel is out, you want to play 5 items that turn. I'd mentioned earlier that very often Ariel is vulnerable at the end of your turn. You've quested for 5 lore, which put your opponent kind of on notice. And they said, oh gosh, I have to defeat Ariel right now. So sometimes when you're not ready to win the game with Ariel, you have to hold her back by playing an item, readying her, and passing the turn. But with Frying Pan, you actually have that ability, that little extra reach. You can look at their board and say, oh, okay, well, they have one character in the back that it could deal with Ariel. So what you can do is you can clang that character to make sure it would not be the one to come back after Ariel. And that gives you the option to quest that final time for your turn. You know, Frying Pan did change the math on whether or not you had to hold back Ariel or just balls to the wall, just quest as hard and fast as you can without any regard to what your opponent was doing. For a long while, that stayed in the deck, but it was only recently that facing just a absolute onslaught of Tinkerbell, Giant Grab Your Swords, and all those kinds of things, that I decided it might be good to try out Mouse Armor, especially because this deck only has like 8 uninkables. I'm just imagining the late game after turn 4, turn 5. How good is Mouse Armor? It gets pretty good. It does, because I'd mentioned Ariel getting down and dirty. Giving her +1 resist means she can do a lot of work. She can take down a lot of characters. I'm just going to challenge, nom, 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 nom. So I have high hopes for Mouse Armor, but it also affects a lot of the other characters favorably. This deck is already pretty resistant to Grab Your Sword, but I think Mouse Armor is going to make it like borderline immune to Grab Your Sword. Before we get to those other characters, though, I want to talk about the card filtering and draw. So as a combo deck, really the goal is to stick Ariel, stick Eye of Fates, and then draw as many items as possible. That means really the most ideal deck in the entire world would be a deck that had probably like 8 Ariels, and then maybe about 8 Eye of Fates, and then 44 Popsicles. I think that would be like the best version of this list possible. But you can't do that in Lorcana. So you have to put other cards in your deck that increase your odds of drawing those things that I just highlighted. So that's where card filtering and card draw come into play. The 3 big ones, which is probably going to be no surprise to anyone who's been keeping an eye on the items game since Rise of the Floodborn. The big ones are Hiram Flowersham, Judy Hopps, and Nick Wildey. Hiram Flowersham is a pretty bonkers card, I would say. And I think that was kind of recognized immediately. I think right after it came out. Let me read him real quick. He's a 4-ink inkable 1/6. So suck it, Steel. It's going to be very difficult for Steel to defeat a Hiram through their damage-based effects. Like double smash, maybe? Like you're going to spend 6 ink and 2 cards to defeat one character that quests for 1? Woof. But the most important thing about Hiram Flowersham Toymaker, his ability Artificer says, basically you can banish one of your items to draw 2 cards. But I left off a very important part to highlight the strength of this card. He says, when you play this character and when he quests, you may banish one of your items to draw 2 cards. Talking a little bit about getting the most out of your investments in cards when it comes to things like card advantage and tempo. To higher level concepts for card games. And Hiram Flowersham falls into that category because he is able to trigger his ability, his Artificer ability, with the moment you play him. You've already recouped a significant amount of your investment. This was basically a friends on the other side is the worst case scenario. That is the worst case scenario is you had a slightly overcosted friends on the other side. And friends on the other side is a very good card, by the way. I think it's probably my favorite purple card, Amethyst card. So that's the worst case scenario. That is the absolute floor for this character. The ceiling is insane. It is drawing, upwards of 8-10 cards a game. It is absorbing several removal spells. It's absorbing smashes, let the Storm Rage on, and multiple attacks. It is having your opponent invest a turn challenging your Hiram with multiple characters to knock him out. Like that, the tempo swing is, and the card advantage swing is, it's all over this card. I probably didn't have to talk too much about Hiram because I'm sure the competitive scene has covered it in great detail. But I just wanted to explain some of the reasons why this card is such a good, and what makes this deck all of a sudden viable compared to Chapter 1 Ariel Item Storm. Judy Hopps is the next character to talk about real quick, and that is a 3-ink inkable 2/3 that quests for 2. And her ability is pretty good. It says, don't call me cute. When you play this character, you may banish chosen item. Its player draws a card. That's referring to the owner of the item. This can be used on your own items to draw a card, and that's exactly what we're going to use it for. It's like a backup Hiram Flowersham. Beyond that, Judy Hopps can be used offensively, so she's not unlike Benja, who's a pretty good steel card that is being used all around, and I think it should be used all around, especially with the rise of the Sleepy Flute and the existence of the Sorcerer's Spellbook in some of the control-centric builds, that you should run item removal. I think one of the biggest mistakes that new players will make is not enough removal. I make that mistake all the time, and I'm not a new player, but I'm just more interested in comboing with dumb cards than stopping my opponent from having fun. But if you want to win matches, you need to interact. And Judy Hopps has that option. You can use her ability on your opponent's item to banish it so that they draw a card. So Judy Hopps is just a way to cycle through your deck. She basically says your deck size is reduced by 1. That's, you know, if you can think about all of the card draw effects, you're now playing with the 59 card deck. A 56 card deck with 4 Judy Hoppses. What you're doing is you're trying to get a higher probability of getting to your Ariel on your next draw, or when Ariel's in play, a higher probability of drawing an item on your next turn. Think of all these card draws as helping that out. Nick Wild is a card that I have not been super huge on in the past. The competitive scene that was running Popsicle Control was really heavy on Nick Wily Fox. His 4 ink, Inkable, 2/4 quest for 2 has an ability called a Hustle. When you play this character, you may return an item named Popsicle from your discard to your hand. These like handcuffed interactions are usually like a sign of a niche playable card. A card that names another card like this. You know, I'm thinking of Jetsam and Flotsam. I'm thinking of Pain and Panic. Those are like not playable outside of fun decks or draft limited formats. They are not like constructed playable because they usually are bad in a vacuum, meaning that if you don't have the other component of their pair, they are below average for what they give you. And so they're inconsistently risky. These are the kind of things that competitive scene avoids, is cards that require a lot of other synergies to exist on the board in order to be better than average. They'd rather just have a card that is consistently good alone, as opposed to occasionally great in pairs or trifectas or 7 dwarves, that kind of thing. But the competitive scene did pick up Nick Wily Fox, because it just goes to show you Popsicle was so good on its own that the risk versus reward, being able to replay Popsicle, was so good that the competitive scene picked up this card. And it kind of surprised me. I actually did not run it for a while. But I needed a few more characters in here. I think we actually ended up overcorrecting to having too many items in this list. You want to think about is we had like 24. Well, we've slowly like wheeled that back a little bit, and we needed to backfill these things with characters that could quest for a good amount of lore that fit into the deck scheme, because Ariel was getting, blasted the moment she was played. She's eating Dragonfires. So we needed some more characters that could have a decent amount of quest on them. This one is, in this case, it's 2. And then, has item-based upside, which, of course, he has a pretty great one. Some other card filling and draw cards to talk about real quick include Develop Your Brain, Simba Future King, and Cinderella Knight in Training. So I think of all these as my filter cards, because they don't net you an additional card. They replace themselves in a way. Let me go over these in a little more detail to explain what I mean. So Develop Your Brain is a card from the first set. I actually really like this card. I don't think people play enough of it because I don't think they appreciate card selection at a very cheap cost like this. This is a 1 ink inkable. It's an action that says, look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put 1 into your hand and the other on the bottom of your deck. So this card basically costs you 1 ink, allows you to pick from the top 2 cards of your deck to replace it with. So you run 4 of these. That means you're basically running a 56 card deck now, because as soon as you play this, you replace it with another card. So your deck size, you have a higher probability playing this card of drawing an item when you need to, or an arrow when you need it. So I like this card a lot for this deck list. Should they ever print this ability on an item? Good Lord. It would be real good. This deck is just only going to get better with the printing of more items. Now, Simba, Future King, and Cinderella Knight in Training, just like Develop Your Brain, I consider these ways to reduce the size of the deck. You play them to draw and then discard a card. Get closer and closer and closer to your Ariel. Now, if you do the hypergeometric calculation, I'm going to go off on another tangent that I'm going to have to cut out of this video. Let me go Google it real quick. Hypergeometric calculator. A hypergeometric calculation is, what is the probability given X number of cards in my deck, drawing X number of cards, of having drawn a card that I need? Drawing 7 cards, the probability of me getting 1 or more is 40%. 0.39995. So 0.399. So about 40%. So there's a 40% chance that in my starting hand, I will have at least 1 Ariel. Now, you draw a card every turn. So let's say that most games end around turn, let's say 8. We're going to say turn 8. So if you draw a card every turn, that means you've drawn 8 cards. 7 if you're on the play, 8 if you're on the draw. you had a 0.69445, or about a 70% chance of seeing an Ariel. That means 30% of the time, your deck is built around a card that you never even drew, which is bad. That's not good in my opinion, which is why I run a lot of these filtering and extra card draw stuff. Because if your deck is built around something like Ariel, Whoseit Collector, you need to draw it in order for the deck to work. So yeah, that's why we run a lot of those cards. And then like I said before, these cards are pretty valuable for things like Last Cannon and also Scepter of Arendelle, giving somebody additional strength and just sending them out into the Aether to take out somebody. All right, lastly, I'm going to talk about the backups, the supporting cast. So I did name this deck a Noi-ing combo after Noi Orphan Thief. I'm also going to talk about Hercules True Hero and the Prince Never Gives You Up. Oop, did I rickroll myself? I think I did. The Prince Never Gives You Up. So these are the other characters that are in this list to help kind of fill out the list, give them some more bodies, defend Ariel. So some of these bodyguards will help allow Ariel to quest multiple times and get that last quest in, not have to ready her and leave her behind. They'll also give you a little bit of early game action, and you can go a little bit offensive with some of these characters. So let's talk about them real quick. We have Noi. Noi is a 2-ink inkable 1/2 that quests for 2. So a kind of aggressive character when it comes to, I hate using the term aggressive because that makes people think challenger, but no, a lore heavy character. Noi has the ability Hide and Seek. When you have an item in play, this character gains resist +1 and ward. That means damage dealt to this character is reduced by 1, and opponents can't choose this character except to challenge. When you have an item in play, she goes from being a 1/2 to a 1/3. And she also has ward. And that's pretty annoying because early game control decks really just want to knock out any high value early game play you have with something like Fire the Cannons. They would like to just make your lore production slower than average so they can recoup the board state in the late game. So they're looking for like these kind of tempo plays, and giving this thing ward just makes them like roll their eyes in frustration that you're going to probably against a control deck get like 4 to 6 lore out of Noi before they can board wipe you, or plop a character out that is significant enough to take her down. So this is like a really good anti-control card. It is worth noting that with resist +1, she can survive a shift sing giant Tink Grab Your Swords. So that's kind of like the most devastating play. Classic play from Chapter 1 would be your opponent shifts into Giant Tinkerbell, which does 1 damage to each of their opponent's characters. And then they use that shifted Tinkerbell to sing Grab Your Sword, which does an additional 2 damage to all characters opponent's control, effectively doing 3 damage to all characters opponent control. That wipes out your first 3 turns of the game off the map, usually. But with the resist +1 and the fact that the situation I just described is 2 sources of damage, that means both of those get reduced by 1. The Tinkerbell's ability gets reduced to 0, and then the Grab Your Swords get reduced from 2 to 1, which means it does a whole whopping 1 damage to Noi, and she survives. So I like that a lot in that it's very anti-Grab Your Swordsy. Sure, you could smash Noi, but it has ward, so you can't smash Noi. So if you can't challenge Noi, the only way you can get rid of it is with a Be Prepared, which costs 7 ink. So by the time they're able to sing and play a Be Prepared, Noi has probably generated 8 lore for 2 ink. I think that's a really good ROI. Now, truthfully, playing Noi in a character congested board state is a little more challenging, which is why you see that I've added a bunch of bodyguards into this deck list. Hercules True Heroes from the first set, and he's a pretty classic character. Doesn't see a whole lot of play because I think people would rather use Steel's offensive capabilities rather than his defensive ones. But I do like Hercules in this list to protect Noi's and Cinderella's. I do like that he has 3 strength, unlike the Prince, who I'll talk about in a second. That means that he very often trades equivalently with whomever is coming after you, him, or he even can get a 2-for-1. Sometimes your opponent will have to send their early game characters in pairs to take down Hercules so that they can get behind Hercules to take out things like Noi. And so Hercules can often be a 2-for-1. Now, truthfully, he usually just is going to eat a removal action. He's going to get hit by a smash or a Strength of the Raging Fire. But that's okay, too, because if they use those on Hercules, they're not going to be using them on Ariel. So he's kind of like a bait card in that regard. So I do like him. He also works well with Scepter of Arendelle. He gives us 3 strength to something else when you exert him to quest. And this is kind of one of the reasons why I haven't settled on one of these. I run 3 of each of these bodyguards in this list because I'm still not sure. I think it's meta dependent on which one I like more. The second one is the Prince, Never Gonna Give You Up. This is a 3 ink inkable. It's a 1/3 that quests for 2, has bodyguard just like Hercules, but also has resist +1. So, this character sometimes shines really well in that your opponent has really keyed in on defeating Ariel, and then you just pivot to putting Eye of Fates on the Prince and questing with him and winning the game that way. That extra lore pip is very valuable on a character who your opponent generally doesn't want to use any removal on. He's, as a 1/4, effectively, he's immune to smash, immune to shifting Tinkerbell, and to grab your sword, all those kinds of things. He has to be challenged. Now, the one place he does fall down is at 1 strength. I really wish he was a 2/3. I wish they could have fit that in there somehow, maybe make him uninkable, I don't know. But that 1/3 makes it so that he can sometimes get swarmed down by early game characters in wide decks. And he doesn't really do a good trade. He's not trading very well. So you're really, ironically, trading off the ability to trade for extra lore. So whether or not that's useful for your deck is debatable. I will say that Scepter of Arendale's value goes down in this deck if you end up cutting Hercules solely for the princes. Support is worthless. So, all right, to wrap up this list, let's talk about the removal real quick. So we had originally we tried a couple of things in this list. We tried Launch. I know people are excited to talk about Launch in this items list, and it's a respectable card. We do not run Launch anymore because honestly, a combo list is not interested in investing a significant amount of its resources into interacting with its opponent. It wants to spend every ink it can on comboing as hard as it can. So in that regard, almost everything in this deck list is aligned like a magnetic field. Every needle is pointing towards Ariel questing multiple times in one turn. Everything else that isn't an item or isn't an Ariel is focused on drawing an item so that replacing itself with an item so that Ariel can quest. So with that regard, Launch was a card that would get stuck in your hand because it's uninkable. And it really had you take a turn off of trying to combo because at 3 ink, a list that curves out at 4, by the way, so it's one of the most ink expensive cards in this list. It asks you to say, hey, stop trying to develop your board with Ariel and instead deal 5 damage to something, knock out a character your opponent controls. And that, sometimes did not feel like against swarm style aggro decks that are running multiple like Lilos, making a wishes and those kinds of things, that just felt terrible. So what ended up happening was Let the Storm Rage On started catching on, and that is a 3 ink uninkable action song that says deal 2 damage to chosen character and then draw a card. And that is entirely right up our alley. The fact that it's singable is incredible. That means I like to think of any singable card as free. If your deck is built right, you should never be like playing a song. You should always be singing it. But so this allows like Ariel to draw her own card. You can exert Ariel to sing Let the Storm Rage On, deal 2 damage to something, draw a card. Hey, it's an item. You basically did 2 damage for free. Now, truthfully, like I said about Launch, taking the time off to sing Let the Storm Rage On or having multiple Let the Storm Rage Ons in your hand has become a problem in a few edge cases. It shouldn't be that big of a problem considering how many loot effects we have, Simbas and Cinderellas, and develop your brains to make sure you don't draw multiple Let the Storm Rage On in the same game or like in back to back. But it does happen occasionally. And because of that, we started to do a split between Let the Storm Rage On and Smash. Good old Smash. And that's going to be a meta-dependent decision, I think. What do you most often face? What is the key damage to deal? Is it 3? Is it 2? Is it 5? What are the things that you're facing that are causing you to lose matches? Which one of these removal spells would work best on those? On paper, Let the Storm Rage On is absolutely the best because, like I said, its needle is aligned with North, and North being get an item into your hand for Ariel to trigger. In that regard, Let the Storm Rage On is the best of these removals, but in practicality in my meta, the Smash is also useful in taking out characters. That's kind of a wrap on the list. I have the link to the Dreamborn below, so you can take a look at it. FYI, right now, at the time of this recording, this deck list is $19.61. So I would classify that as a budget list. I don't really know what budget is going to mean for Lorcana. The prices have changed so drastically over the last month. Before in Magic the Gathering, I consider any deck list under $100 budget, but that's because I play EDH 100-card deck lists. This is a 60-card deck list, but $20, I mean, that's less than like a solid Chipotle meal. So I feel like this is going to be considered a budget list, and I think it's pretty good. I would say it's obviously not competitive tier. It can get walloped pretty badly by some of these several $100 lists that have been tried and true, but it's definitely something that can impress a more casual scene. I mean, it's not oppressive, but it's impressive. Not oppressive, it's impressive. Check out that deck list. Leave your comments. Let me know about your meta and what you'd change to make it more effective in yours, the things that you see. All right, that's a wrap on this annoying combo. So thanks for tuning in, and be sure to definitely subscribe and, do the whole bell thing. I don't know how YouTube works anymore. So you can get notifications, because I will be putting out some gameplay of this list. For more Lorcana content, like and follow Lorcana University. There's always an option, by the way, in your meta to pivot this to go into the 5 ink level. It curves out at 4. But going into 5 does open a few more doors. Like, the deck might actually just be better if you stall the game longer with things like grab your sword. Or forget all these little incidental filter loot effects, and instead you just run a whole new world. And say, I'm going to play out as many things as I can, and then a whole new world into the Ariel. A whole new world with Ariel in play, and just hopefully draw 7 items. That's also could probably be a valid version of this list as well. I'm focusing on this one because I really love playing as many bad cards as possible in a list. So when I see things like Simba Future King, Cinderella Knight in Training, things that aren't normally played a whole lot outside of this, Last Cannon, Scepter of Arendelle, which does see a little bit of play, and now Mouse Armor, those kinds of things, it brings a smile to my face that I'm able to play these things and kind of open people's eyes to unique deck designs.